To make certain we capture your information correctly, please wait. Please wait for the tone, then say your company name or affiliation and press the pound or hash key.
Good day, everyone, and welcome to the South Carolina Department of Transportation Multimodal Statewide Transportation Plan, Interstate and Strategic Corridors Stakeholder Webinar. Today's conference is being recorded. At this time, I would like to turn the conference over to Mark Pleasant. You may begin.
Good morning to everyone. Again, my name is Mark Pleasant with the South Carolina Department of Transportation in our planning office, and we certainly appreciate your involvement this morning and your interest and willingness to participate. This is the third of 3 webinars that we have held this week, and I know I can see some familiar names of folks that have participated in each one. And again, we've had good involvement, and look forward to some more of that this morning. I think that most of you are aware this has been a multi-year effort to update the state's transportation plan, and we're in partnership this go around with our South Carolina Ports Authority and the South Carolina Department of Commerce, so we appreciate being able to work with our state partners in that effort. Today's session is going to be focusing in on the work that's been accomplished on the interstate element and as well as the strategic corridors element of the plan. If you recall, back in April we had some initial webinars, April of 2013, and at that time we really were just getting into some of the existing condition information. And since then, obviously, there's been a lot of effort and work, interaction with stakeholders to look at the information and to begin to develop some analysis and some findings. And so this morning is about being able to share that with you. And I'm certainly encouraging you guys to ask questions and be involved in the dialogue. That's sort of the benefit of using the webinar format. Also, many of you have been emailing questions after the sessions, the 2 earlier sessions, and we'll be following up on that. And again this morning, as you begin to look at this information and decipher it and think about it, we will be more than happy to receive your comments in the coming days on the webinars, and our consultant team will be working to follow up on that as we begin to develop drafts of the plan and the various elements. So, with that being said, again, thank you for your participation. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Carroll, who is leading our consultant team, to begin this morning's session. Jeff, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Welcome, everybody. This is our 3rd webinar this week, as Mark noted, and excited to be able to present some of the results to you today. And Mark said this is very interactive, so we want to have a good discussion. Just to orient yourself to your website that you're looking at, you should be able to see a red dot. If you look up by the feedback button here, this is a document button. You can download some interstate maps, handouts on there that will help you see them at different levels. These are in the presentation, but you may want to download those, keep those handy for today and for future reference. Up here as well, there's a Q&A tab on the top bar. If you have a question that you'd like to type in rather than coming in by voice, we can do that as well, and we'll be reading those at different portions of. We have about six or so Q&A sessions at the end of each presentation, so I encourage you to type in questions. Lori's our operator. She'll ask at points in time to open up your line. She'll instruct you how you'll be able to do that, and you can talk to us and ask questions. Just make sure when you do that, just unmute your phone if you are on mute. If anybody's having any technical issues with the website right now and you're just listening by voice, we've had some of that with firewall issues and that. This slide here, you can go to the website, www.scdot.org/multimodal, and the PowerPoint is on there. You'll see it right on the front page. You'll be able to click on it and download it, and you can follow along with us. So if anybody's having any technical issues, you can go to that project website, pick that up, and follow along. Also, up in the top right, you'll see it's probably a green square. You can pull that down if we're going too fast or too slow or whatever. You have a question, you can change your colors. We'll certainly monitor that as well and try to accommodate any of those issues that may arise. So with that, as Mark noted, today is talking about the interstate plan and the quarter plan. And before we do that, I'm going to give a quick update on the modal needs and the process and the differences between the last planning effort and the new planning effort that we've been doing over the last year. Then Spencer will come in and update us on the baseline revenue projections. Don Berry will then come in and talk about the modal scenario work that's going on, different investment choices, planning exercise that we're working on currently. Karen Hadley will come in and orient us a little bit with the website that's out there, show you, if you haven't been to that site, where you can find documents, where we are placing information out there. And Mike Plagans will talk, or excuse me, Rick Reeve from Stantec will talk about the interstate plan and give us an update of where we're at. And then Mike Plagans will finish us out today with the update on the strategic quarter plan. Just before we get into both of these, both of these are at a point now. When we met last time, we were not at a point where we were developing a statewide travel demand model. Through the summer and working with the DOT, we added a contract modification. At this point, we're developing a South Carolina statewide travel demand model. So everything you'll see today on the interstate plan and the quarter plan, you'll see some INRIX data. They'll explain what that is if you don't know what that is. But we are looking at the future congestion levels, and that's not going to be ready till later this spring. So right now we're just looking at existing conditions. They'll get involved in that, and we can have a time for Q&A. But I wanted to mention that up front, that we will have information on future congestion that will be later on in the spring. So with that, I'll move into the multimodal transportation needs update. Probably many of you were part of the planning process back, probably started in 2006 and ended in 2008, that developed a 2030 multimodal transportation plan. And as Mark said, we started in July of 2012 to update this next plan, and the horizon year goes out to 2040. And this slide here is just to show the differences of how the needs were collected through the database use, tools, agency coordination, and the modes. In the 2040 update that we're completing now, you can see the databases that we're using is the Highway Performance Monitoring System. That is a database developed by and collected by SCDOT, provided to FHWA on an annual basis. The base year for this plan is 2011. And the analysis tool that links into is called HERS-ST. That is the FHWA developed analytical tool that looks at future needs on the highway system. So it will look at expansion needs, it will look at modernization needs, and it will look at preservation needs. And it uses the HPMS database. It's reported out on functional class. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Similar, you can see here, on the bridges, we use the 2011 National Bridge Inventory. And the tool there, another FHWA-sponsored tool, is called NBIAS. And previously, there was no databases used, no analytical tools for highway and bridge. It was the result of coordinating with DOT staff as well as MPO and COGS and looking at their planning efforts. Certainly, we've done a lot of agency coordination throughout this process, not only with the DOT, but the DOT in this effort has partnered up with the Port Authority as well as the Department of Commerce and FHWA. And through that, you can see how the modes have changed. Last plan looked at highways, bridges, mass transit, premium transit, and passenger rail, developed needs estimates for that based on agency coordination. This time, we do those same modes, highway, bridge, mass transit, premium transit, and passenger rail, but we've added in freight rail, ports, aviation, and bike and pedestrian needs. The freight rail needs, as we'll talk about, are mostly short lines. It was very difficult to get Class 1 rail needs from our Class 1 railroads that operate here in South Carolina. The ports, and working with the Port Authority, they have a 10-year capital improvement plan, and that's the needs number that we used there. The aviation, we coordinated with the Department of Aeronautics. They have a 5-year capital improvement plan, and we used those needs. And then bike and ped, we had that webinar yesterday, and Alta Planning on our team worked with the MPOs and the COGS to develop a bike and pedestrian need. So there's a lot of differences between the 2030 MTP and the 2040 MTP. Most of it are technical changes, and just wanted to highlight that in this slide. The assumptions in the engineering analysis for HERS ST on the road side, as I mentioned, we use this Highway Performance Monitoring System database. And it's all specific information for South Carolina. So we identified when a need would be triggered or when the performance would get to a certain level that would trigger a need. From that, we would say we're going to design it to this level here within South Carolina, and then the unit cost information was obviously South Carolina. So we vetted that with DOT staff, input and reviewed that very closely. So we feel we have a very good number on the highway needs. And that because we've used this tool and we're using data that's here in South Carolina. Similar with the bridges, using the National Bridge Inventory here in South Carolina, and MBIAS has over 50 different measures. Talks about bridge replacement, modernizations, rehabilitations. We know the extent of those needs, coordinated those through DOT staff, got their input and review as well, so very helpful. On the non-highway side, talked a little bit about it on the last slide, but we did it very similar to how it was done back in 2006 and for the 2030 plan update. And then we looked at plans, report studies. We coordinated with DOT, other agency staff, MPO staff, and council of government staff as well to update those non-highway modes. And then once again, as we've mentioned a couple times here, the planning horizon has changed. Last year in December, I should say December 2012, the Transportation Task Force came out and updated the 2030 needs numbers to 2033 through a linear growth estimate using a 2 or 3% growth rate. We've certainly looked at those needs, and then this plan takes it out to 2040 horizon year, so it adds another 7 years to that. So just in recap here, you can see the difference. The highway and bridges, we have a lot more robust tools, databases, specific cost information from South Carolina that has given us an estimate that we believe is very accurate. Mass transit, premium transit, passenger rail is very similar to how we included last time in the planning update. We've had a couple questions as we went through on I-73. We are looking at new location roadways. While our technical analysis tools don't do that, we've certainly looked at the MPO plans, COG plans out there for critical new location roadways. So I-73 and that cost estimate is part of the modal needs number at this point. The rail, freight, ports, aviation, bike, ped, that's all new again. So we're not going to release a number on the needs today. We're still doing the final vetting with the department executive staff as well as our partners with Department of Commerce and the Port Authority. We do expect that should come out here this winter. How we'll communicate that to the stakeholders is very similar to how we've done other updates. It's through the website, which Karen will orient us to here in a few minutes. We've emailed out quarterly updates, and we'll probably have an update here soon, and it will come out via email to our stakeholders. And then we do have probably another webinar potentially coming up, but definitely in May is the time frame now where we'll have public comment on the statewide plan and the 5 distinct modal plans that we're working on as well. We'll be going to each of the 7 DOT districts around the state to do a presentation and get feedback from local folks throughout the state on the planning efforts that have been done. So there's going to be some ample opportunities. So with that, I'll open it up to questions, Laura. If there's anybody online that would like to talk to anybody on the team about this, myself, the DOT, we can answer those questions. If you'd like to type something in, please do so on the Q&A tab on the top of your screen.
Certainly. And if you would like to signal for a question, please press star 1 on your telephone keypad. Again, that's star 1 to signal for questions. Please be sure your line is not muted.
I don't have any typed in yet.
And no questions from the phone at this time.
Okay. Everybody's still green, so that's good. All right. To keep things moving, then I'll turn it over to Amanda. If for some reason you do want to ask a question later on, we'll have other opportunities. We can certainly answer any questions at any point in time. But with that, I'll turn it over to Amanda, and she can run through our baseline revenue projections.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jeff, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning to share with you our baseline revenue forecast work that we're completing as part of this plan. I'm going to go ahead and jump to the next slide, which the purpose, it says purpose in the top right-hand corner for those folks that are following along on paper. The purpose of our baseline revenue forecast work is to quantify how much revenue is expected to be available over the life of this plan, and to make a comparison with those modal needs that Jeff spoke to identify any likely funding gap during that time. Jumping to the next slide to talk about sort of how we put this baseline revenue forecast together. The forecast is a projection of business as usual. We assume there will be no new revenues coming into play over the life of the plan in this work. So no changes and no new money. We align well with the modal analysis and cover the same 30 years, 2011 to 2040, to be consistent with that work. So we have a revenue total for those 30 years. We look at existing revenue totals by all the various federal and state sources and short-term expected amounts for those line items. And we apply assumed annual growth rates to each of those line items, and those are custom to the various sources. We derive those growth rates that are applied out to year 2040 by looking at historical information and also examining expected future trends. We also make an assumption about the future of inflation, and currently we're assuming 2% average annual inflation, and this is in line with what the Consumer Price Index has been over the last 10 years. So making that comparison to the assumed inflation allows us to estimate the loss in buying power that South Carolina is likely to face over the next 30 years. Going to the next slide, this is our baseline forecast results. It's estimated that South Carolina will have $27 billion available out to 2040 to address those modal needs, and that $27 billion is in today's dollars. And what I want to show you here with the picture of the pie is just the composition, how we get to that $27 billion. Almost half is made up from your federal highway revenues, and this is predominantly from the federal portion of the motor fuel tax that you pay at the pump. And we're assuming that revenue source will be flat over the life of the plan, so no growth. And our assumption there is largely due to increasing vehicle efficiency. Next, moving clockwise, the next biggest component is the state highway revenue, making up 20% of the $27 billion, and that comes from your state portion of the motor fuel tax that you pay at the pump. On that revenue source, we are projecting that the gasoline portion would decline 0.5% per year, and the diesel portion will increase at 3% per year over the life of the plan. You should know that these numbers that you're seeing here are the dollars that we estimate to be available for capital improvements. So we have removed things like salaries and debt service and paying other commitments. All this money will go to, again, to improvements to address those modal needs that Jeff spoke to. The next category is your federal transit revenue, making up 4% at about $1 billion. And similar to the federal highway revenue, we expect or estimate flat growth over the life of the plan. The next piece there is the state transit revenue, and that comes from two components. The first is a $57,000 annual general fund transfer for transit, And the second component is about $6 million a year, which comes from 1/4 of 1 cent of the motor fuel tax. Here we've also removed any salaries and administrative costs in running the transit program. The next 3 sources that you see are categories that are out of DOT control, but these programs or sources have consistently contributed to improvements on the state system. So for these 3 categories, which is the State Infrastructure Bank, Special Purpose Local Option Sales Taxes, and the C-Fund, which is the county money, we looked at historical contributions from those funds on the state highway system and made a conservative estimate of how those programs will likely contribute to addressing those modal needs in the future. And you can see the result there. 8% or $2 billion is expected to come from the State Infrastructure Bank, 16% from those local option sales taxes, and 3% from the C-Fund. I'll mention that for those of you who aren't familiar with the C-Fund, 25% of that money does have to be spent on the state system, but historically more has been contributed. At this time, I'll go to the next slide that says total available revenue at the top. And here we're conveying the same information, it's that same $27 billion just shown over time. I wanted to give you an indication of the annual level of revenue. So on average, in today's dollars, it's about $900 million per year to go to address those address the modal needs. And second, I also wanted to illustrate that loss in buying power. The top solid line is nominal dollars, not considering inflation, and that lower dotted line is your real dollars that do consider that 2% inflation. So if our assumptions were to hold true about slow revenue growth and around 2% inflation, South Carolina would face about a 24% reduction in buying power. With that, I'll ask Lori to open the line for any questions that you might have.
And again, that is *1 to signal for your questions. We'll pause for a moment.
There's no questions in the Q&A box. If anybody would like to type one in for Amanda, you can type it in using the Q&A on the top of your webinar screen.
I'll be on. Sometimes folks think of revenue questions after Don speaks to the modal scenario, so feel free to come back to me if you'd like to. But if there are no questions, I'll go ahead and pass on to Don Berry to speak about the modal scenarios.
No questions.
Thanks, Amanda. This is Don, and we'll be talking about developing and evaluating the modal scenarios for the plan. We just heard from Amanda about the revenue forecast. Before that, we heard from Jeff about the needs assessment. For all the planners out there, and especially the ones involved with financing and funding, we know that there's never enough money to meet all the needs. And so these modal scenarios are a way to show us different ways of meeting the needs and the trade-offs involved. For the next few minutes, I'll provide a status report on our work on the modal scenarios. The work's ongoing, and we hope to wrap it up sometime by next month, early February, hopefully. So the modal scenarios are a way of developing different allocations of long-range plan transportation revenues. They're not a detailed budget document or a STIP or a TIP. They're just a description across broad categories of modes and functions of the different directions that the department can take over the lifetime of the plan, and what the implications of those directions and budget allocations might be. The modal scenarios, once they're formulated, and we'll show you those in just a minute, we evaluate them according to the types of quantitative criteria, some of which Jeff described, and the tools involved with the best quantitative tools we can apply to an exercise of this type. But also, we use a fair amount of judgment as well. It's not an exact science. It's a combination of using the best analytical tools we have and using common sense and planning judgment. And then the result of this exercise is going to be a set of recommendations on funding allocations as well as implementation strategies and maybe some policy recommendations as guidance for the multimodal plan document. The scenarios use a lot of the outputs of the plan process up to this point. In fact, it's just about all of them. We just talked about the needs and the revenue forecast. Certainly that's the very basis for doing the revenue allocation in the scenarios. But we also need to know something about what's important to the department and the users of the system. And so we make use of what we've gathered from our outreach sessions as well as the translation of all of that input into the goals, objectives, and performance measures. And this creates new inputs for our modal scenarios. All of this information helps us understand what the right investment categories to describe are and to develop some reasonable measures of effectiveness to really describe the trade-offs between the scenarios. Okay, the modal scenarios assume that many of the department's current programs are going to remain exactly as they are. So Amanda talked about a revenue forecast of about $27 billion. For the modal scenarios, we don't use all of that money. We consider the programs such as, say, bridge reconstruction on the interstate system that are going to stay exactly as they are. They really have to keep the system in a state of good repair and keep the system safe. So we take those dollars, those committed dollars, so to speak, off the table, and we work with the remainder. In this case, the remainder is about $12.7 billion. So when we talk about these modal scenarios, we're talking about different ways of allocating the $12.7 billion from the revenue forecast. And we've developed and worked with the department to create 4 different themes, if you will. These are broad and general themes, but they're meant to show some contrast between different emphasis areas and the trade-offs involved with the limited resources available. The first is called Keep the Highway Core. It's our baseline scenario, and really the emphasis is on defining and funding a core highway system that's well maintained and where the congestion is addressed. And we're talking about the highway system that serves the major population centers and activity centers, the connections between those and the mobility inside of them. The second scenario is what we're calling the multimodal core system. Same basic idea of defining a core system that serves population and activity centers and the connections between them and the mobility inside of them. But rather than focusing on highway, there's more of a focus on multimodalism, including funding for transit, rail, and non-motorized. And none of these scenarios really defund any mode or goal area. It's just a question of a little bit more emphasis in one particular function or mode than another. The third scenario is called the drivers, serve the drivers. This is really aimed at economic results and creating investments to spur business attraction and retention. So it directs investments relatively more towards improving connections to places such as ports, airports, tourism locations, leisure destinations. It's really meant to stimulate economic activity. And then the fourth scenario is called right-sizing the system. Right now, the department has a large highway system. It's 42,000 miles, give or take. And so this scenario is really meant to ask the question, is the current system too large given the department's revenue stream? And is there any way to address that by perhaps right-sizing the system? So each of these scenarios can be described in terms of our 5 goal areas and how they're being emphasized. The 5 goal areas, you may or may not recall, just to remind everybody, they're here in this chart: mobility and system reliability, safety, infrastructure condition, economic and community vitality, environmental, and equity. So serve the drivers, keep the core and baseline puts a little bit more emphasis on system reliability and infrastructure condition. Serve the drivers a little bit more on economic impacts and community vitality. The multimodal core system on some of these other goals, community vitality, environmental outcomes, and equity. That's really more the emphasis area of the multimodal scenario. And then right-size the system, like keep the core, puts relatively more emphasis on mobility, system reliability, and on infrastructure condition, but in a smaller system. All of the scenarios, and just got this circle to highlight the point, pay absolute first attention to the safety goals. So there's a baseline level of safety each of these has to achieve. We can also describe the scenarios in terms of their ability to meet the needs that Jeff described in terms of capacity and preservation. So we've aligned here in this table the scenarios by different transportation system elements, including the interstate system, the roadway system that's part of the other federal aid system, the primary and secondary system that's not the interstate system, local roads that may not be part of the federal aid system, passenger transportation such as rail and bus and freight rail. So here too, we've begun to allocate dollars in ways that provide more or less emphasis across these system elements. And just to give you an idea, got circled some of these elements. What you see in the table is our initial assessment of the ability of these scenarios to meet full capacity needs in this case relative to the other scenarios. So the baseline scenario, the Keep the Highway Core, is really focusing on the interstate and the other federal aid components. The multimodal core scenario is focusing a bit more on passenger rail and bus. Serve the drivers on freight rail and some passenger rail and bus, and right-size the system on the federal aid and interstate system, albeit a smaller system. We're taking the same type of assessment in doing the budget allocations for these scenarios. In terms of modernization and preservation, I won't go over all of these in detail, but the dollar allocations are pretty much going in a way that's consistent with the general definition of the scenario. So we're looking at these dollar allocations in terms of capacity and also in terms of preservation and modernization. As I said, we'll hope to wrap this work up the remainder of this month, beginning of next month. Our next steps are to complete the analysis of the scenario performance according to the goal areas, but also according to some measures of effectiveness we'll describe in just a minute, but also to describe the trade-offs in a way everyone can understand across these different allocations and the policy implications of the different scenarios and the way the dollars are allocated. Some of the measures of effectiveness we're looking at include bridge and pavement condition, impacts to users of the system, including travel time and delay, total user costs, including vehicle operating costs, and just a general sort of qualitative assessment on whether, as we just saw, these allocations address the goals as our stakeholders have told us that they should. So with that, I'll turn it back to the group and see if there are any questions.
And again, that is *1 to signal for a question on the phone.
I have no typed in questions, Don.
Okay.
Anybody would like to type in a question, please do so.
We have no questions on the phone.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
All right. We'll turn it over to Rick Reed from Stantec to give us an update on the interstate plan. Thanks, Rick.
All right, thank you, Jeff. Good morning, everyone. Everyone logged in, and thank you for your time this morning. Again, I'm Rick Reed with Stantec, part of the CDM Smith consulting team. I'm located here in Charleston. I wanted to talk to you today about our progress on the interstate plan at this point and what we need to do to finalize the efforts. This is a brief overview of the presentation today. Start off about talking about the data that's been gathered and how we've used it to evaluate congestion across the entire interstate system. I also want to talk about the cost of potential improvements to the congested areas today, as well as environmental screenings that were conducted. Finally, I'll wrap up the discussion today by talking about the next steps that we need to do based in part upon the feedback that we received today, and open it up to answer any questions that you may have. First, I want to talk about the data collection. Again, INRIX was the big driver of our data analysis. If you don't know, INRIX is a company that collects billions upon billions of pieces of information about roadway speeds from over 100 million anonymous mobile phones, trucks, delivery vans, and other fleet vehicles equipped with GPS locator devices. INRIX then provides real-time traffic information, historical information, traffic forecasts, and travel times all throughout the U.S., including South Carolina. As an example, the data is collected, is processed in real time, creating traffic speed information for major freeways, highways, and arterials across the United States. If your local news has weather updates and traffic updates, now they have the real-time traffic maps with the red, yellow, and green movements describing the existing speeds. That's based upon INRIX or another vendor with a similar information. So it gives you an idea of what the INRIX data can be used for. For the interstate plan update, we considered the average hourly speeds across all Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays in 2012 to get our average speeds for analysis. We also got a lot of data from SCDOT, including their automated traffic recorder data. We got our peak to daily factors, directional factors, truck percentages, urban-rural boundaries from the 2010 census data, and then also a number of existing lanes on the interstate from observed conditions and types of terrains as well, from level terrain out here in the low country to rolling terrain up in the Midlands and upstate. Here's a list of the 11 interstates in South Carolina. For the analysis, we considered 4 study hours, 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, 7 to 8 and 8 to 9 in the morning, and 4 to 5 and 5 to 6 in the afternoon. Our performance measure for the evaluation is freeway density, which is defined as the number of cars per mile per lane on the interstate. This is also the same metric that the Highway Capacity Manual uses to determine level of service for interstate and freeway facilities. Density is made up of speeds in miles per hour and the flow rate, traffic volume or flow rate to volume to capacity ratio. Level of services are graded on a scale from A to F. Level service A is the best level of service, basically free flow conditions on the interstate, ranging all the way down to level of service F is breakdown or unstable flow, where the traffic volume demand is greater than the capacity of the respective facility. With INRIX data and all the DOT data, we conducted spreadsheet analyses to determine freeway density for all the segments. From those spreadsheets, we created these maps for each individual interstate. You can see here that we have a map for the AM peak hour, which is on your left, and on the PM peak hour on your right. First up this is I-20, which these maps show the worst case level of service for the peak hours. So out of the 2 peak hours in the morning and afternoon, these maps show the worst level of service. For I-20, as you can see, the primary congestion points are between Alpine Road and Clemson Road in the Columbia area, where I-20 operates at level service E conditions in the respective peak hours. It should be noted that this segment is currently under construction for widening from 4 to 6 lanes. The I-77 and Clemson Road interchanges are the respective bottleneck points along I-20 during the respective peak hours. In addition, on the west and north sides of Columbia, there's a 16-mile stretch of I-20 from South Lake Drive to Main Street that operates predominantly at level service D conditions in the respective peak hours, eastbound heading into town in the morning, westbound heading out of town in the afternoon. During the afternoon, the bottleneck points along I-20 include the 3 interchanges with Broad River Road, I-26, and US 378. And as we go through, I'm going to go through all the interstates here. If you go to your handouts tab, or I believe they're on the website as well, all these maps are in the handouts for you to closer review. So for I-26 in the Columbia area, the primary congestion points occur in the eastbound direction from Lake Murray Boulevard to I-20 heading into town in the morning, where 26 is operating at level service E conditions. In the afternoon, I-26 westbound operates at level service E or F conditions heading out of town from 126 to Piney Grove Road. For Columbia, the primary bottleneck points are the I-20 interchange and St. Andrews Road interchanges during the respective peak hours. In Charleston, primary congestion points along I-26 occur eastbound from US 52 connector Ashley Phosphate Road heading into town to West Aviation Avenue in the morning, where 26 operates at level service D conditions. And during the afternoon, I-26 westbound operates at level service D conditions from Montague Avenue all the way out to Ashley Phosphate Road. The primary bottleneck points along I-26 in Charleston include the US 52 connector Ashley Phosphate Road interchange, as well as the 526 interchange. Moving forward to I-77, in the Rock Hill area, the primary congestion point occurs northbound in the morning, heading into Charlotte from Gold Hill Road to Carowinds Boulevard, where our analysis showed level service D conditions throughout all of 2012. In Columbia, there's a primary congestion point occurs in the southbound direction from Killian Road to Forest Drive during the morning peak hour, where several segments also operate at level service D. The primary congestion or bottleneck point along 77 in Columbia is approaching the Forest Drive interchange, likely due to the weekly graduation ceremonies at Fort Jackson every Thursday morning. Here are the results for I-85. As you can see, there's a 39-mile stretch between River Road and Greenville County and Fort Prince Boulevard in Spartanburg County that predominantly operates at level service D or worse conditions in both directions throughout various times of the day. In the northbound direction, in the morning, the primary congestion point is between Maudlin Road and Lawrence Road, which operates at level service E conditions. During the afternoon peak hour, in the northbound direction, the primary congestion points are between I-385 and Pelham Road, which also operates at level service E conditions. As you may expect, the I-385, I-85 interchange is the primary bottleneck point for I-85 northbound. In the southbound direction, the primary congestion is between SC14 and, again, the I-385 interchange. Southbound operates at level service F or E conditions during the morning and afternoon peak hours. And again, I-85, 385 interchange is the primary bottleneck. Here are the results for I-95. As you can see, it predominantly operates at level service A or B conditions for its entire length in both directions throughout the day. This is I-126 in Columbia, and then primary congestion point is between Saluda River Road and I-26 in the afternoon, heading out of Columbia, where it operates at level service E conditions. The bottleneck being the I-26 interchange, 126 interchange in the afternoon peak hour. This is the Southern Connector I-185, and again, this operates predominantly at level service A or B conditions throughout the day in both directions. Here are the results for I-385. In the northbound direction, primary congestion occurs in the morning peak hour from Bridges Road to Roper Mountain Road, where 385 operates at level service D conditions. During the afternoon peak hour, southbound direction operates at D conditions in the opposite direction. And again, the primary bottleneck along 385 is the interchange with 85. Here are the results for I-520 in North Augusta, and again, it operates at predominantly level service A conditions in both directions throughout the day. Here's I-526 in Charleston. There's a 12-mile stretch between Savannah Highway, US 17 on the west side, and Clements Ferry Road that predominantly operates at level service D or worse conditions in either direction throughout various times of the day. In the eastbound direction, the primary congestion points in the afternoon is between International Boulevard and I-26, which operates at level service E conditions, the primary bottleneck being the I-26 interchange. In the westbound direction, the primary congestion points in the afternoon are between Clements Ferry Road and I-26 and between International Boulevard and Paul Cantrell Boulevard, which operate at D, E, or F conditions. The primary bottleneck points being the I-26, 526 interchange, as well as the Paul Cantrell Boulevard interchange in the westbound direction. And here are the results for I-585, the Little Orphan segment in Spartanburg. And again, this operates at level service B conditions throughout the day. So as an overview, kind of a summary of the results of the analysis, which we believe matches very well with the existing operating conditions. One of the benefits with our spreadsheet analysis was that we're able to also quantify the level of congestion along these interstate segments and use it to compare and rank the respective levels of service throughout the state. We first created a density index measure for each individual interstate segment, which is simply the sum of all the densities for each of the 4 peak hours in both directions. We then compared and ranked the levels of congestion for the individual segments for all segments of the interstate system. We also combined segments into larger corridors to compare like facilities in different parts of the states. Segments were aggregated into corridors based upon similar adjacent densities as well as cross-sections. An average density index for each of the corridors was then calculated and used to compare and rank all the interstate corridors across the state. So before I tell you the results of this analysis, let me open it up to a poll question. What interstate does the audience believe is the most congested interstate in the state? And I'll give you a minute or so to vote now. Okay, as votes are coming in, it looks like I-85 has the most votes, with I-526 close behind. Let me show you the results for the interstate corridors. I-526 in Charleston actually accounts for 2 of the top 5 congested corridors in the state, including the top corridor on the western semicircle around Charleston. I-85 is, again, close behind is second most congested corridor in Greenville County, and then I-26 and I-20 corridors in Columbia round out the top 5. And then similarly, here are the top 20 individual segments, which are very similar to the congested corridor. Again, these segments are from interchange to interchange. And several segments of I-85 in Greenville, I-26 in Columbia, and I-526 in Charleston make up the most congested locations in the state. And also in the handouts is our results for all the interstate segments throughout the state for all interstates. So you can go through those as well and look at our results for each of the interstates. I want to back up now and talk about how this all fits into the bigger picture overall DOT planning process. These congestion analyses of the interstate plan is just a piece of the ranking and prioritization step of the bigger process. As I previously discussed, for asset management, if we want to start at the top, DOT uses the freeway density measure as its metric to evaluate the entire interstate system for asset management, which leads into the ranking and prioritization using in part the density index metrics that we've previously discussed. For those top interstate corridors that have been identified for improvement needs, development of detailed corridor management plans is the next step. I'll talk a little bit more about those on the next slide. And then once funding is made available, improvements identified in the corridor management plans can be programmed into the STIP and the TIP, and the projects can then be constructed and implemented. Finally, the last step is monitoring of the interstate system, including developing a comparison of before and after operations, measuring the impacts of the improvement. This last step can be vital and illustrate the benefits of a large-scale, high-cost project to policymakers, stakeholders, and transportation system users. So going back to the ranking and prioritization step, these congestion analyses are combined with other factors of Act 114 to develop a final prioritization for improvements to the interstate system. We also considered is the safety and crash issues, truck traffic, pavement quality, economic impacts, as well as potential cost and environmental screenings, which I will talk about both of those in a little bit as well. As I previously stated, the next step would, after the improvements are prioritized, would be to conduct corridor management plans to identify alternatives to resolve the current congestion issues and address future needs in a holistic manner. Improvement alternatives can include those in the travel demand management strategies, modal strategies including transit improvements, as well as freight strategies, traffic operations improvements, and finally capacity adding improvements. Implementation of travel demand management, modal, and traffic operation improvements and strategies are generally a smaller scale, but can give a better bang for the buck. They may not get rid of the need for higher cost capacity adding improvements, but they may put off the need for 5 or 10 or more years. Several studies have already been conducted using this detailed planning process. And these corridors can correspond to the top congested corridors in the state. Based upon the results of the studies, improvement alternatives ranging from near-term, low-cost strategies to more costly future year additional capacity strategies have been identified. And this is a list. I-26, I-20, I-126 in Columbia. A plan of action study has been completed. I-85 corridor study has been completed in Greenville, as well as north of Spartanburg. And the I-526 corridor study has been completed in Charleston. So as part of our plan with developing the interstate, we also looked at order of magnitude planning level cost for the top 10 most congested interstate corridors. And these estimates were based upon several sources, including the results of the existing corridor management plans recently completed, as well as estimates from the SCDOT Planning Office. Let me, before we show you the results, let me go to another poll question. How much does the audience believe it would take to improve the top 10 congested corridors in South Carolina? Less than $1 billion, $1 billion to $5 billion, or more than $5 billion? If you're going to take a minute and vote. It looks like the majority of folks understand the needs on our interstate system, with 75% of guessing more than $5 billion. Let me go back to, and here's our planning cost table list. The cost for 526, I-85, and I-126 or I-26, I-20 have been mainly based upon the results of the corridor studies, where the other costs have been based upon the planning office estimates. As you can see, it's not cheap, and I think folks on this call realize the amount of money that it's going to take to improve our highway infrastructure. If you do add all this up, the total cost for improvements to improve the top 10 congested corridors is north of $4 billion. So it's not quite $5 billion, but it's pretty close. It's still a lot of money. And finally, I want to ask one more poll question. Does the audience agree with the top 10 congested corridors in the list? looks like we're getting pretty good consensus with the top 10 congested corridors. For the one person who did click no, if you wouldn't mind typing in your disagreement in the Q&A box or raise your hand at the end, we'd love to hear what your thoughts are on the list. Finally, I want to talk about the environmental screenings that were conducted as part of the interstate plan. These are high-level screenings for potential environmental impacts along the entire interstate corridor. These screenings considered wetland impacts, streams impacts, threatened and endangered species impacts, as well as cultural resources impacts. Each of these potential environmental impacts were scored on a high, medium, low scale for the entire system. And here's a map of the results. You can see the high impacts are there in red, medium impacts are there in orange, and the green impacts are there as well for the low environmental impacts. I'll move on to this is a summary table of the environmental screening impacts. You can see I-85 has the highest percentage of segments ranked as having low potential environmental impacts, while I-520 has the highest percentage of segments ranked as having high impacts. However, I-520 contains also does not is operating at level service A predominantly throughout the day, so it's not likely that improvements will be needed in any short time. I-77 does have one of the highest number of interstate miles ranked as having high impacts, with approximately 8.3 miles in Columbia. And this segment's also been identified as having being a top 10 congested interstate corridor. Several segments of I-526 have also been identified as having a high impact that are part of the top 10 congested interstate corridors as well. And as previously noted, these environmental results will be considered in the ultimate prioritization rankings. Okay, so that's where we're at right now with the interstate plan. We have 2 tasks ahead of us for first part of this year. First one is the SCDOT's Interstate Interchange Management System. DOT is working to update the software. So updated traffic volume and geometry information for the interchanges can be inputted, and we can generate a list of the top 20 interchanges that are in need of improvements. Once that occurs, we'll review the interstate and interchange priority results to determine if any of the high priority interchanges fall within the high priority interstate segments, which we have a feeling may happen, especially up in Greenville with I-85, I-385. And then secondly, as just alluded to earlier, CDM Smith is developing a statewide travel demand model that will have future traffic volume projections that we also need to consider and compare the results to the congestion analysis for existing conditions to make sure that they sync up as well. So with that, I'd like to conclude the presentation and thank you for your time this morning. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Again, *1 to signal for your questions.
Hey, Rick, I'm looking at the Q&A. No one's typed in anything yet, but if anybody would like to type anything or talk to us, that'd be we'll open up your line. I guess to add a little bit on the end of the work, the INRIX data, we'll certainly be using this, and Jenny spoke to this yesterday at the webinar for those that were on, but those were not. We're certainly using the INRIX data for bottleneck identification, for freight analysis as well, and that this work is being incorporated into the freight plan. Mike's going to be talking about the quarter plan as well, and we'll be using similar information to help inform the freight plan on both the strategic quarter network and on the interstate system.
We do have a question from the phone. I'll open the line.
Please. Hello, this is Stephen Langer. I have a question for you. Actually, 2 questions, if you don't mind. The first question is, when I-77 was constructed, and this may not be the right area to ask this, but just in case, when I-77 was constructed, why was there no thought given to continuing it onward, going, of course, intersecting with I-26, but going a little further and looping back around onto I-20, so to make really a complete circle around the city? That's one of my questions. The other question is, when do you anticipate we'll actually be getting to drive on I-73?
Jeff,
Rick, I don't know if you have those answers. We got folks from the DOT probably on this call as well. I mentioned earlier about I can handle I-73. I think right now it's a need, and there's no obviously identified funding for it other than the earmark, I believe, for an interchange. So it is part of the needs analysis number as far as estimating a time of when one would be able to drive on I-73. I wouldn't have. I don't think anybody here on the phone, even at DOT, would put a date out there at this point. It's been identified as a need, and of course a lot of work's gone into it. The big issue is obviously funding. On the I-77, I've heard a lot of talk about that before. I don't know if anybody has any historical knowledge, if it's environmental issues or obviously cost as well, if that was looked at. But I don't know if anybody else on the phone wants to add to what I've said. I know they're not direct answers. I apologize for that. But
Jeff, this is Deepak.
Hey, Deepak. Thanks.
I-77 in the 70s and 80s, when it was being developed, there was thoughts about punching that through to 95, not to 20. But in the long-range plan for Columbia area, I know there's different scenarios being looked at, but not to punch 77 to 20. It's to go south towards 95.
Okay.
Okay, then I have one other quick question, if I may. May I ask one more question?
Sure.
Okay, don't remember for sure if it's on I-26 and the St. Andrews area or on I-20, somewhere in that same area. But I've noticed that the walls that separate the two directions of the lanes have what look like would be future bridge abutment types of things on there. What was the plan for that, or what is the plan for that?
Yeah, I'll speak to that. Years ago, there were some preliminary plans developed for improvements along that corridor, but it became an issue, again, of funding. But as improvements were made along the way, they attempted to go ahead and incorporate some of the foundations for the future bridges, and you see that in other locations across the state where you, at the time something is built, you're trying to anticipate what may happen in the future. Unfortunately, what happens oftentimes is by the time the future arrives, conditions have changed, and you really need to implement a different design. So it's always not the best idea anymore to try to do that. But that's why those are there.
Okay, thank you.
There are no other questions at this time.
I don't have any in my queue either on any typed in, so we'll be able to move on here. We'll, Mike, you hear us all right down there?
Yes, I sure do. Once again, I want to thank everybody for joining us this morning. I'm joined by Praveen Pasmarthi, who led our corridor work, and also by Janine Fear, who did our needs assessment. Anyway, I'll jump right into it. Basically, we worked on the corridor network plan, and one of the things that we ended up working on was with the strategic corridor plan was talking with DOT and a lot of their needs and assessments. One of the things that they really wanted to do was to jump ahead and actually have a tiered network approach. That was one of the things that talking with DOT and Mark that we really felt would be a better way to not only identify what would be the primary needs, but to also reach out as far as a lot of our rural network as well and make sure that we had a great covering across the entire state. We also wanted to focus on our federal network criteria and bring in a new object that really wasn't looked at before, which is economic development. One of the things that was critical, and we got a lot of support from DOT on, was the baseline impacts for environmental screening. And then, of course, we met before, so it's good to be back with you all, on getting your MPO and COG needs, and we'll also be looking at the corridor delay and deficiencies, as both Rick and Jeff had talked about with the INRIX data. And then we also had some congestion management strategies that we looked at as well. One of the things with the baseline criteria, as I said, it was a tiered system development, and the idea was that we were meeting the greatest statewide needs and national goals, but at the same time looking at our rural needs and connectivity as well. We had our scoring criteria where we looked at interstate mobility and our economic and community vitality as well. As far as our baseline criteria, we brought together and designated NHS routes, the highway system routes, and then, of course, we looked at the national freight network and, of course, the connection to our strategic StrawNet network for the military, as well as the statewide evacuation routes. And then, of course, we decided that we need to have everything connected together as a complete system, so we had intermodal connectors as well as far as our baseline criteria. As far as, how do we get into the interstate mobility scoring, we looked at the obvious things, the AA, the annual average daily traffic, and the truck AADT. We also looked at statewide and regional connectivity. We needed parallel receivers and, of course, a connection to other modes, especially the other hubs and other strategic hubs throughout the state. As far as for economic and our community vitality scoring, we pulled together the data from the census for the 2010 and our projections for the 2040 population. We looked at urbanized areas and clusters, our employment, and of course, one of the things that was in the last plan that we carried forward was the importance of tourism to the state. As far as working together with you and DOT, we pulled together our strategic corridor network. So I want to go ahead and thank everybody for all their work as we went through and reviewed this process before. As far as what we have with this network, we had the Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. So I want to go ahead and first, I guess, because we might have some new people joining us, I guess my question is I want to have a poll question. The poll question is, did you review and comment on the draft strategic corridor network plan? And if people can just take a moment and kind of fill that out. I just want to make sure if we had any new people on the phone. Okay. Well, I was going to say, as we're going through and kind of getting that information, if for the 5 people who did not participate before, I guess, welcome. But if you had any additional comments or thoughts, if you can please go ahead and submit that in at the QC questions at the end, that would be great. If you have any questions on the actual network itself. All right, now we'll go back to the presentation. As far as our next slide here, one second, our system's thinking. Okay, environmental screening. All right, environmental screening. Basically, for our environmental impacts, we had to be consistent, of course, with the new federal level, the MAP 21, and of course, Act 114 here in the state. So from that standpoint, that's where we pulled our environmental impacts, and we did very high-level methodology, much like the interstate, where we looked at as the wetlands, streams, the threatened and endangered species, and of course, cultural resources, and our scoring system to rank each of the resources. As we can tell, we just like the interstates, we had a low, medium, and high. So you can go ahead and see that, of course, we had a lot of the medium and high corridor ranking along the coast as expected. As far as our multimodal needs, the idea how we're working with that is assessing our corridor delay and deficiencies, of course, pulling projects from the MPO and COG plans, doing a level of service analysis, and looking at multimodal criteria. Of course, much like a lot of this is kind of an ongoing process as we get more and more data, as Jeff mentioned, as we start getting into the modeling and the INRIX data. As far as our vehicle hours and lost performance, this is the information we got from Rick. So Rick, if you want to jump in here, that would be fine. But I just wanted to go through this. Basically, what we looked at is we're going to be looking at the individual strategic corridor segments, and we're doing a comparison and ranking the respective levels of congestion. Then as far as we get the interstate and the AADT for both directions of each segment, we're going to be calculating the average travel time versus the free flow, uncongested travel time. As far as with the vehicle hours lost, the index performance for the corridors, we're going to be looking at the levels of congestion and ranking that for the strategic corridors. And then we're going to be combining the segments, the larger corridors, both uniform length and logical breaks. And then as we define the weighted average of the segment, the vehicle hours lost across all corridor segments. As far as with the MPO and COG needs, data requested, we went ahead and, of course, reached out to you and asked for unconstrained needs on the corridor. And we looked for project information and project descriptions, termini, and cost. And so with that, I'd like to go ahead and ask another poll question. The poll question is just kind of a simple one that basically just says, did you submit needs on the strategic corridor network plan? Yes or no, or if you still have to do so, that would be great. Okay. I guess I would want to thank everybody for submitting needs for the corridor network. And for those that didn't, hopefully you can go ahead and we'll be able to submit some projects, and we'll go through those here in just a minute. The needs that we collected, the majority of the needs were, of course, on US 123 and 17 and 25, 78, and US 378. And a majority of the needs that we received were from the COG of Whac-A-Mole and Couplah. Here are the MPO and COG needs on our map as far as how they relate with the overall spread of corridor projects across the corridors. And as far as kind of wrapping this up and kind of filling it back in, how does this process fill into the overall planning approach? The idea, of course, was that we were going to implement the corridor management plan and looking and coordinating with you, employing our projects from the MPO and COG plans. And then, of course, the idea was that we need to focus on the long-range considerations of the statewide model, which, as Jeff said, is going to be finishing up hopefully in the spring. And then we wanted to go ahead and make sure that we were focusing on our economic considerations as well. One of the things with corridor management, real quickly, that we just wanted to go through and identify the projects, some of the access management stuff that you guys are already doing, which is wonderful. And on 9 near US 17, and then, of course, some of the traffic signalization on US 17. Some of the improvements that we got as a need on the geometric improvements and down in Lower Savannah on US 25 and 45. And then, of course, the transit services that were being done on US 21. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions, or if anyone had any ideas, or if they want to submit any comments now, that'd be great. Thank you very much for your time.
As a reminder, that is *1 to signal for your questions.
Thanks, Mike. Looking at the Q&A, there's no typed in messages or questions.
We do have a question from the phone. I'll open the line. And caller, your line is open. If you could check your mute button on your phone for us. And again, to our questioner on the phone, your line is open.
Hello, this is Fred Payne in Greenville. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Mr. Payne. Yes, sir.
Okay, my apologies. First of all, very interesting session today, and I think the INRIX data is a great way to help explain and understand this. And I'm very interested in applications, especially in Greenville County. So, but thank you for sharing that. I've got a couple of questions. Number one is I've been listening in on the sessions for the last couple of days, and the one thing that I wonder is there any correlation between like the strategic plans here for interstate highways and like transit? Do you make any attempts to integrate transit into interstate solutions? For example, I know, first of all, the INRIX data is 2012. So does that include traffic counts after the widening from 4 to 6 lanes for the southern part of for the Interstate 385 south of 85? Do you know?
I believe that was under construction for part of 2012, so it'd be both before and after. Okay.
So it's some kind of a combination maybe. Anyway, the point is, we spent a lot of money, $76 million or something like that, to improve that 7-mile stretch of road. And that's good. We're grateful for that. But the problem is, I don't believe you can build capacity to outpace demand. When you increase capacity, you increase demand. More people feel like, well, they've improved I-385, so therefore I can go to it and use it, and so more people are attracted and try to use the same segment of road. So I don't know if you agree with that principle or not, but I think, so my question is, how can we provide other alternatives like transit that would be more effective? And yesterday we had some discussion about an old railroad corridor between Highway 291 and really Malden and Simpsonville. It parallels Lawrence Road, and it actually is between Lawrence Road and 385. And if we could increase multimodal traffic along that corridor, which is not used at all now, but we own it. The county owns the corridor right of way for 3.5 miles, 3.4 miles, and if we could use it to develop not just bike paths, but maybe some kind of transit-related traction, we might be able to take traffic off of 385 without trying to add additional lanes there. And same thing is true for Woodruff Road traffic, which is everybody's nightmare in Greenville. So let me stop there and say, is there any effort made to incorporate the two, transit and interstate planning?
Mr. Payne, this is Jeff Carroll, and we, it's a great question as we look to how we solve our mobility and transportation problems and issues within the state, and specifically the interstate, from a quarter standpoint, is really helping to influence the freight plan, as I mentioned earlier a little bit. However, we can, as we look to, we're probably, maybe to use an analogy, we're about a 30,000-foot level on a statewide planning effort. What we're doing here, as we identify, say, interstate congestion, as we identify quarter congestion, what the department will do is they're going to do follow-up studies on this, and they'll get down to the 10,000, 5,000-foot level where they'll look at actually viable alternatives to the congestion issues. Now, we're going to identify projects in the interstate plan, the quarter plan, and that, but in order to get to the level, that needs to be done to understand what is the true issues here and what are some of the solutions to that. Getting at what you're saying is that's typically doesn't happen in the statewide planning process. We're going to look at the overall needs and then further granular studies will look at it a little bit closer. So, Deepak, I don't know, I know you do a lot of this work, or Mark, others, I don't know if that's a correct way to say it, but you make a very good point of how do we solve these issues in that. So certainly we're going to use this information. It is going to help us during this effort and future efforts that are either done by the NPO, COGS, and or the state.
Jeff, this is Deepak. Once we've identified the corridors, I mean, on 85, we did a 28-mile section from 25 to US 29 in Spartanburg, and we did a corridor management plan, which was pretty intensive. It wasn't at 5,000; it was down to the ground because we did levels of services, design options, and the way we developed those was in 4 categories: it's travel demand management, modal options, traffic operational, and capacity improvements. With that in mind, we partnered with the local authorities in those areas to develop the plans. So, Fred,
yes.
If you go online, you can see the plan for 85. We haven't done one for 385 yet.
Right.
That may be in the future, and the section of.
But you are about to do the intersection at 85 and 385, which I think it's going to be that's going to be good. That's going to help some of the bottleneck right there as people are coming up on on 85 and it sort of bottlenecks. But I will tell you another thing that you don't do. There's no planning for getting across really an interstate is like a huge barrier from one side to the other, and there's no way to get from one side to the other by bicycles or other kind of non-vehicular traffic or transit-related traffic. So I think we need to, even as we plan to do these kind of solutions, we need to look at, well, have we considered everything? Not that bicycles want to ride on the interstates, but, I mean, you got to figure they're out there somewhere, right?
You're absolutely right, Fred. On the I-85 corridor, if you look at the study, right, we looked at parallel routes where we could improve for bikes, pedestrians, and so forth. Also, if you look at the I-85 study, you'll see that we considered all those situations, and park and rides and things like that as well, and total transit stations. And so if you read the study and look at it, you'll see where we're going with this. We've got to start somewhere, and I think we're going in the right direction.
Yes, sir. Well, I appreciate that, and I appreciate you letting me just make those comments. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you, Mr. Payne. Lori, does anybody else have a question that they've asked to come in?
No other questions in queue at this time.
I don't have any typed in either. All right, while we wait on that, I do want to give Karen an opportunity to go through the website and kind of orient us to that, and then after this we'll have a follow-up kind of next steps, and if we have any overall questions. So go ahead, Karen.
Thanks, Jeff. Hi, everybody. I just wanted to give you a quick overview of our project website in case you haven't seen it yet. On this website, you can find all the information about the statewide transportation plan and any updates to the plan or upcoming events we post on our front page right here. And on the stakeholder webinar page, you can find copies of all the handouts and documents that were talked about and copies of the presentation. And in a couple of weeks, we will also have notes of these presentations and webinars posted on there as well. But on this page, we've got the 2040 plan overview, which covers a brief history, a plan timeline, which we cover what's coming and what's already been completed, and potential dates for those completed plans and public participation upcoming. We've also got project news, which includes some quarterly status reports, And as Jeff mentioned at the beginning, we'll be having another quarterly status report coming out soon. But this is also posted as a PDF document, so if you want to download it and send it on to other people, that's an easy thing to do. We've also got project documents, which we have our technical memorandums, and our plans will be posted here. So keep checking on that, and as things get posted, we'll be sending out updates in that quarterly status report. Also, we have additional resources for federal highways and just about the planning process in general. And one of the best features of the website is our Contact Us feature, which at any point you could send us an email, which goes to Mark Pleasant, the project manager, and he will respond to you or pass the message on to whoever it needs to go to get you a response about your question. Also, if you have any information that you think is missing or that you'd like to see, please let us know, and we'd be glad to provide that for you. So with that, Jeff, I'll hand it back over to you.
All right, great, thank you. Can you put it back to the basic presentation, Karen? Thank you. All right. So that's our webinar for today. Certainly appreciate, number one, you taking the time out of your busy schedule to sit and listen and interact with us today. I will, before we move on, if anybody, maybe Laura, we'll just find out if anybody has one last question before I kind of do next steps and contact information. There's nothing in the Q&A type there, but just check one more time, see if there's any other general question about anything we talked about today.
We do have a question in queue. Again, that is *1 to signal. I'll open the line.
Right, thank you.
Thank you. I've got just one last question. I hope you don't mind my asking one more question. This is Stephen Langer in Columbia. I'd like to find out whether there's been any consideration to light rail between the northwest part of Columbia, the St. Andrews, Irmo, Chapin area, coming into Columbia by light rail, perhaps, for passengers.
I think we got some folks on from Central Midlands, Council of Governments. They have done an alternative analysis, kind of looked in that area, I do believe. I don't know, I haven't been on their website lately, but I do believe if the study has happened, it would be out on centralmidlands.org website. I'm just seeing the attendees, if I don't want to call on anybody, but I know they've been participating this week. I'm just
It's Doug Freight from DOT. I do know that working in concert with Central Midlands, we did conduct a regional rail feasibility study, commuter rail, light rail. It was actually a premium transit study that also incorporated bus rapid transit. And the analysis of that study showed that based on the cost that would be necessary for the introduction of such premium transit alternatives such as light rail and other opportunities, the population, the density, and the demographic criteria that's necessary to support that did not lend itself to moving forward with those projects at this time. And what is being moved forward with are more commuter express type services as well as park and ride opportunities that both we're looking at as well as Central Midlands, the RTA, the Council of Governments, and the MPO. That is really sort of a first step in that direction. Should in the future population and demographic criteria change to support moving forward with premium opportunities in the future. But at present, it just didn't lend itself to that given the nature of the costs that were involved. However, we are moving forward with taking a look at, like I said, park and ride commuter express type opportunities that will sort of serve as a first step in that direction.
All right, thanks, Doug. Does that help you, Steve?
Yes, thank you very much.
All right, thank you. All right. Anything else, Lori? Anybody else need to come in and ask a question?
No other questions at this time.
All right. As you can see on the slide here, we want to hear from you on what we've talked about today and about the process and moving forward. If anybody has any other comments, questions, Mark Pleasant's contact information is there on the screen as well as mine. I'd encourage you to reach out to us. Continue, as Karen just showed us, to go out to the website. We'll continue to send updates out on a quarterly basis. As we move through the winter into the spring, as I mentioned earlier, we do plan on traveling the state in May to present the draft plans of the statewide plan and the 5 modal plans. The goal then would be to finalize those in the month of June, keeping in mind that the department updates these every 5 years. So this exercise will happen again in another five years as we continue to plan here in the state. So with that, I don't know if anybody at the DOT wants to have any closing comments or remarks at all, but certainly want to thank you for your time today and efforts in your involvement in these studies.
Jeff, I would just echo the same thing to everybody that's out there. You know, I think we had some really good dialogue, some good questions and good interaction, so appreciate your involvement, and we will keep you plugged in as we work towards developing drafts and some additional public involvement.
Right. Look forward to it. Thanks again, everybody.